Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Welcome again to the podcast. Last time I spoke to you about contemporary or recently gone American poet Robert Creeley, who in some ways brought a simplicity and a gift of song back to American poetry that was going so far into a personal narrative kind of poetics that something else really seemed to be needed. Now, of course, Creeley's song is, though often filled with short lines, it can be quite complex. But I want to go today to another period in the history of poetry in English, and to William Blake. William Blake, a poet who flourished in the last couple of decades of the 18th century and then continued into the early part of the 19th century. It's difficult to know what causes impacts in poetry, what causes things to change. For example, I have no doubt that what Blake brought to poetry was a major change from what had been prevalent in his time and just before his time. However, I'm not sure Blake had very much impact in his own time. His works existed in extremely small editions that were printed in an etching process and a hand-colored process, so that there were very few copies. There were probably more artists who knew what Blake was up to. However, in the visual arts, he was just as much of a departure as he was in the poetic arts. I want to read something. Let me say I'm fortunate that I have a life partner who is a gifted painter, and she also cares a lot about thinking about the arts. And so I'm borrowing from her library today. I'm borrowing a book in the Masters of Modern Art series on William Blake that came out in the 1920s, 1928 to be exact, published in London. John Lane, The Bodley Head Limited, published it. And also a little set of paperback books I'm borrowing from her, which are in the Dover publications, which bring together in a little box William Blake's Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which you could do far worse for an introduction to Blake than to begin with those poems. And those poems in Dover thrift editions. Dover's great because they don't give you a lot of critical apparatus, but they do some wonderful work in publishing and keeping in print some works and versions of works that otherwise might be difficult to find. And these books are, and I trust their introductions on this, purportedly in a similar size to what Blake's original printings done by himself, printed and bound by himself, would have looked like. And it's just rather amazing to try to read Blake in this handwritten script, which he either would have had to write backwards because the printing process flips it. He would have had to etch it backwards, or possibly he was able to write on some kind of paper, lay it down on the etching plate so it made a a pattern that he could then etch. But I think it probably just as likely that he etched backwards. Blake, probably many people thought Blake was a little backwards, and I don't mean that as a diss at all. I mean that he did not do things in the way one might have expected a poet and artist of his time to do things. This book in the Modern Masters series, Masters of Modern Art, is by Philippe Soupault, himself one of the founders of Surrealism. And Blake, who is by no means a surrealist, one can certainly see him as a rebel and revolutionary in his art, and might be a model for some of the rebels and revolutionaries in art in the early 20th century, which certainly includes the surrealists, André Breton and Philippe Soupault in poetry, certainly. This is from the introduction, and partly I want to read it because I think it's revealing about Blake, and partly as just a wonderful homage from one artist to another. William Blake. England, the home of respectability, has witnessed the birth of some strange and occasionally praeterhuman geniuses. None of her sons, however, was more utterly disconcerting to her sense of propriety than William Blake, Mad Blake as he came later on to be called. Perhaps there never was a man who more thoroughly merited the title of genius than this poet engraver, whose sole ambition was to be himself, and that to the fullest possible degree. Moreover, his genius was so manifest that none who knew him could withhold their tribute of admiration for what their sense of decorum compelled them to call his madness. Blake quickly succeeded in freeing himself from the trammels of time and space, in sundering once for all every bond that might have fettered him to ordinary, mundane existence. He dwelt in a supernatural world, where criticism and irony were not, well out of range of the bursts of sardonic laughter which mount up from the spawning earth. That is certainly not understated. How much it is overstated might depend on your place in this range of respectability to a certain unfettered relationship to mundane existence. Now, some of the language towards the end of that is pointed, I think, to talk about Blake not being bound by a sense of criticism and irony. The poetry of the 18th century, and all the way up to Blake, and I'm thinking of probably particularly poets like Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson, was dominated by irony and satire, and provided a critical view of mankind. In probably the finest poem by Samuel Johnson, The Vanity of Human Wishes, the poem begins, "Let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru." I'm not looking at that, so I might have gotten it slightly wrong. I think it was purview rather than view. But you get the point that it's written from a point of wisdom, of distance, of observing, and it is meant as a criticism of humankind, and particularly of the vanity of humankind, the vanity of human wishes. Of course, one of Alexander Pope's great poems was titled An Essay on Criticism, and his longer poems often were like essays. Blake is nothing like this. Not to say that Blake didn't have some criticism of humankind. But Blake's poems were not dispassionate, were not framed as essays. They are visionary, passionate, they explode. And in some ways, they are not poised from a position of knowledge. They are poised from a position of human embrace of what it simply means to be human, even from what it means to be a child to what it means to be in a world where there are many more possibilities than most people seem to think there are. Blake walked with historical figures. Blake walked with figures from the Bible. Blake walked with angels. And I mean that quite literally. He would walk and have conversations with these other figures. And of course, that is why some people probably thought him mad and others thought him curious. But certainly, he was not pretending to have such visions. He was having such. Okay, so much for Suppose introduction, which is brilliant. It's about a 60-page essay which prefaces a work which presents some of the visual plates of Blake in black and white, which is okay. I mean, you will love seeing Blake in color. And certainly if you want to visit the William Blake Archive, search for that on the internet, and you will find the opportunity to deeply dive into so much of Blake. Some of my favorite Blake are the late poems, the so-called prophetic poems, visionary poems such as Milton and such as Jerusalem. Jerusalem might be the place I go to Blake more than any other, but I have so much enjoyed in recent days looking at these relatively early, not the earliest, but relatively early works of Blake in the Songs of Innocence, the Songs of Experience. Why? Because you can feel this sense of song. You can feel a complexity of thought. But let's look at a poem called Infant Joy in the Songs of Innocence, very early. I have no name. I am but 2 days old. What shall I call thee? I happy am. Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Pretty joy. Sweet joy, but 2 days old. Sweet joy, I call thee. Thou dost smile. I sing the while. Sweet joy befall thee. Now imagine a poem like that by Alexander Pope or Samuel Johnson, barely be considered a poem, although I have somewhat higher hope that Johnson had a mind which could embrace such a work. But it is not trying to impress anyone with its wisdom, with its depth of thought. It is simply singing from that infant place which has no name, which is happy, which has sweet joy, and then ending with sweet joy befall thee. It is a hope for everyone. The words of this poem, as it was first printed in Songs of Innocence, the title was in the top left in a nice script. There was an image of a flower, large. Within that flower were a mother with child, what seems to be an angel in front of them, and then the green stem of the flower and another flower surround the hand-scripted text of the poem. It takes a little while to read this, to get used to Blake's way of writing. And to just make it out, perhaps being an example of what contemporary poet and critic has called slow poetry. Slow poetry. You want to spend time with it. You want to be in its space. This is a mode which is throughout the Songs of Innocence. Not all the Songs of Innocence are quite so innocent. Little boy lost and little boy found. There's some frightening material in here, but it is all from the heart, with a sense of both the joy and the terror of being in the world with its possibilities. Okay, I'm about at the length end of these podcasts, so I'm going to stop now, but I may come back to William Blake at some point. Thank you for listening.